Ever wonder why some islands are abandoned and why people still disappear on them? Most people think islands are supposed to be peaceful, quiet beaches, fresh air, a chance to escape from the rest of the world. But sometimes the places that look the safest are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Tonight, you'll hear 3 true horror stories from isolated islands where people went looking for peace, history, or adventure, and found something they still can't explain. A man rents a tiny cottage on a remote island, only to wake up to a stranger whispering his name through the front door. A structural engineer exploring one of the world's most abandoned islands discovers undeniable evidence that someone is secretly living there, before realizing he isn't alone. And a group of college students sneaks onto an abandoned island in New York, where something pretending to be their friend tries to lure one of them into the darkness. These aren't ghost stories passed around the internet. They're real experiences that left the people involved with questions they'll probably never answer. So lock your doors, turn off the lights, and let's head to 3 islands where leaving was the only way to survive. Last year, I was 22 years old, and honestly, I had reached a point where I felt completely drained. Work had taken over my life. Every morning felt exactly like the one before it, and every day blurred into the next. It was one of those stretches where you wake up, go through the motions, come home exhausted, sleep for a few hours, then do it all over again. It almost felt like I was watching someone else's life instead of living my own. I knew I needed to get away, not to some crowded tourist town or fancy resort. I wanted somewhere nobody could bother me, somewhere I could disappear for a few days and just breathe. After searching online, I found a vacation rental that almost looked too good to be true. It was a tiny standalone cottage sitting on the shoreline of a small island off the coast of Maine. No neighboring houses, no traffic, no tourists, just ocean, trees, and silence. The price immediately caught my attention. It was surprisingly cheap. Honestly, cheaper than anything else I had looked at. Looking back now, maybe that should have been my first warning. But at the time, I didn't question it for a second. I booked a place, packed a small bag, and headed out the following weekend. The ferry ride was peaceful. The further we got from the mainland, the quieter everything became. Cell service started dropping in and out until eventually there was almost nothing left. The island itself was tiny, more trees than buildings, and after getting off the dock, it only took me a few minutes to find the cottage. It was exactly as advertised. Small, just one room with a bed, a kitchenette squeezed into one corner, and a tiny bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. Thick brush and tangled bushes surrounded the entire place, pressing so close against the walls that it almost felt like nature was trying to swallow the cottage whole. It looked isolated. Perfect, I thought. I unpacked my things, spent the evening listening to waves crash against the shoreline, and for the first time in months I actually felt relaxed. Around 10:30 that night I climbed into bed, planning to watch a few videos before falling asleep. That is when I realized my phone charger had stopped working. I tried bending the cable. Nothing. Unplugging it. Nothing. My battery was already below 10%, and within the next hour the screen went black. No phone, no flashlight, no way to contact anyone. I shrugged it off, figuring I'd deal with it the next morning. The island was quiet enough that sleep came almost immediately. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up for no reason at all. At first, everything seemed completely still. Then I heard it. Crunch. A long pause, crunch. Another pause. Slow footsteps moving across the gravel outside. Not running, not wandering randomly like an animal, deliberate. Patient, as if whoever was outside wanted me to know they were there. Every step sounded closer than the last, and then a bright beam of light suddenly pierced through the thin curtain covering the front door. The light swept slowly across the room, cutting through the darkness like whoever was outside was carefully studying every inch of the cottage. I froze. Every instinct told me not to move. I stayed perfectly still in bed, barely breathing, hoping whoever it was hadn't noticed that someone was inside. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of boots stepping onto the small wooden porch. Thunk, asterisk, asterisk, another step, then another. The old porch boards creaked under the person's weight. Whoever they weren't trying to hide anymore. I listened as they stopped directly outside the front door. For a few seconds, nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes every heartbeat sound painfully loud. Then the doorknob slowly turned. Once, twice. The metal rattled softly as someone tested the handle. When it didn't open, they pushed a little harder. Thankfully, before going to bed, I'd locked the deadbolt without giving it much thought. Now it was the only thing separating me from whoever was standing outside. The pressure against the door stopped. Another long silence followed. I remember staring at the ceiling, afraid that even swallowing would make enough noise for the person outside to hear me. That is when a man's voice quietly came through the door. "I know you were in there, Leo." Every hair on my body stood up. I wasn't scared anymore. I was terrified. He knew my name. Not just that someone was renting the cottage. Not that someone was inside. Vinny name asterisk asterisk. I had never been to that island before. I hadn't spoken to anyone after arriving except the ferry operator and the woman who handed me the rental key. There was no sign outside with my name on it. No reason for a complete stranger to know who I was. My mind started racing through every possibility. Had someone followed me from the mainland? Did the owner tell someone I was staying there? Was this some kind of robbery? Or something much worse? I couldn't answer any of those questions because I was too busy listening. After another few moments of silence, I heard the boots move again. But instead of walking away, they began circling the cottage. Crunch. Past one side of the wall. Crunch. Behind the bathroom. Crunch. Past the back window. Each lap was painfully slow, with long pauses between every few steps, almost as if the man was stopping to listen for movement inside. It felt less like someone searching for a way in, and more like someone enjoying the fear of knowing I was trapped. I never looked through the windows. I never called out. I never made a sound. I simply sat there in complete darkness, praying he would eventually leave. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The footsteps never hurried, never stumbled. They just kept circling the cottage again, and again, and again. I have no idea how long it went on. It could have been 30 minutes. Maybe an hour. When you are lying in complete darkness, convinced someone is waiting just outside your door, time completely loses its meaning. Every tiny sound felt amplified. The wind brushing against the bushes sounded like someone reaching for the windows. The old wooden walls groaned as the cottage shifted, making me jump every single time. I kept telling myself to think logically. Maybe it was just someone who had too much to drink. Maybe they had the wrong cabin. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for why a stranger was wandering around an isolated island in the middle of the night. But none of those explanations answered the one question I couldn't stop asking myself. How did he know my name? Asterisk asterisk. That thought refused to leave my head. I thought about making a run for it. The dock couldn't have been that far away. But the moment I pictured opening the front door, I imagined him standing right outside, waiting for me. If he wanted me to come out, there was no way I was giving him that chance. So I stayed exactly where I was. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed somehow felt even worse. I couldn't hear breathing. I couldn't hear movement. Nothing. I remember wondering if he was still standing outside the door, waiting for me to make a mistake. I sat there for several more minutes, too terrified to move. Then, somewhere out toward the shoreline, I heard a sound that immediately caught my attention. A boat engine. It started with a low rumble before growing louder for just a few seconds. Then it slowly faded into the distance until the island became silent once again. I didn't celebrate. I didn't relax. For all I knew, he could have shut the engine off and come right back. I stayed awake until daylight finally began creeping through the windows. Only when the room was completely lit did I find the courage to unlock the door. The cool ocean air hit me as I stepped onto the porch. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal. Then I looked down. Heavy boot prints covered the gravel. Fresh, deep enough that the soles were clearly visible. My stomach dropped. The tracks came straight from the dock. They led directly to my front door. From there, they wrapped around the entire cottage over and over again, forming a complete circle before heading back toward the shoreline. There weren't multiple sets of footprints. Just one. One person had come onto that island in the middle of the night with a single destination in mind. My cottage. Whoever he was, he hadn't been wandering around. He hadn't accidentally stumbled across the place. He had arrived by boat, walked directly to my door, spoken my name, circled the cottage for what felt like hours, and then calmly returned to his boat and disappeared into the darkness. I packed everything I owned in less than 10 minutes. I didn't stay another night. I caught the first ferry back to the mainland and never returned to that island. Even now, a year later, I still think about that night more often than I'd like to admit. The part that keeps me awake isn't that someone found the cottage. It is that someone somehow knew exactly who I was, before I ever heard his voice. And to this day, I still have absolutely no idea how they tracked me down. Story 2 is where things take an even darker turn, because this time, the person trapped on an abandoned island discovers undeniable proof that someone is secretly living there, and realizes they're no longer exploring the island alone. If you think the first story was disturbing, this next one is even harder to explain. Unlike the previous story, this wasn't someone looking for a quiet vacation. This was a professional. Someone whose entire career was built around observing buildings, studying structures, and noticing details that most people would never even think to look for. Which is exactly why what happened on Hashima Island still bothers him years later. At the time, I was working as a structural engineer. Several years ago, I traveled to Nagasaki, Japan, to attend an academic conference focused on aging infrastructure and abandoned industrial sites. During one of the discussions, a professor I had known for years mentioned that he might be able to arrange something very few people ever get the chance to experience. A research permit. Not for a museum, not for an active construction site, but for Hashima Island. Most people know it as Battleship Island. For decades, it was one of the most densely populated places on Earth, built around a massive underwater coal mine. Thousands of workers and their families once lived there inside towering concrete apartment blocks surrounded by the sea. Then the mine shut down. Everyone left, and the island was abandoned almost overnight. Since then, nature and time have slowly taken it back. Concrete walls cracked, hallways collapsed, windows disappeared. Entire buildings became empty shells overlooking the ocean. It is the kind of place that feels frozen in time, as if everyone simply walked away one afternoon and never returned. Because of its dangerous condition, public access is heavily restricted. Tourists are only allowed onto designated walkways, and venturing into the old residential buildings without permission is strictly prohibited. That is why receiving this research permit felt like an incredible opportunity. When I arrived at the dock, I was introduced to the man assigned to accompany me. His name was Takeshi. He wasn't particularly friendly. He barely spoke at all. After a quick nod, he simply gestured toward the boat. The ride to the island was quiet. As Hashima slowly grew larger in front of us, it looked less like an abandoned town and more like a giant concrete warship rising straight out of the ocean. Even knowing its history, seeing it in person was unsettling. There wasn't a single sign of life. No voices, no birds, no movement. Just endless rows of empty apartment buildings staring back at the sea. The silence was almost unnatural. Once we stepped onto the island, I immediately understood why so many people described it as haunting. Every hallway echoed. Every doorway opened into rooms that looked exactly as they had decades ago, only now covered in layers of dust, broken glass, and crumbling concrete. As a structural engineer, I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was studying the buildings themselves. The stress fractures, the exposed steel reinforcement, the effects of saltwater corrosion after decades of neglect. I was paying attention to things most visitors would never notice, and that is probably why I noticed something that didn't belong. I stopped walking almost immediately. Something about the floor caught my attention. At first glance, the hallway looked exactly like every other part of the building, layers of dust covering the cracked concrete, pieces of broken ceiling scattered across the floor, and years of neglect frozen in place. But after spending my entire career inspecting structures, I'd trained myself to notice the smallest inconsistencies. This hallway had one. Running straight through the thick layer of dust was a narrow path. Not footprints. A path. It looked like someone had been walking the exact same route over and over again for a long time. The dust had been disturbed so consistently that it formed a faint trail leading all the way down the corridor. I crouched down for a closer look. The dust everywhere else was untouched, thick enough that nobody had stepped there in years. But this path was different. Someone had been using it. Recently, I looked over at Takeshi. He was standing several yards behind me with the same blank expression he'd worn all morning. "Do you see this?" I asked. He glanced down the hallway for barely a second before quietly saying, "Keep moving." His answer caught me off guard. He didn't seem surprised. If anything, he seemed like he didn't want me paying attention to it. That only made me more curious, instead of listening. I followed the trail. The hallway stretched farther than I expected before ending at a small apartment near the corner of the building. The door was hanging slightly open. I hesitated for a moment. Then I pushed it the rest of the way. The room looked abandoned. At least at first. Old furniture sat exactly where it had probably been left decades earlier. A rusted bed frame leaned against one wall, pieces of plaster covered the floor, and broken windows overlooked the gray ocean outside. Then I noticed something in the far corner. A pile of blankets. They weren't neatly folded. They looked used. Right beside them sat several empty plastic water bottles. Modern ones. Not something left behind when the island was abandoned. Someone had carried them there. Someone had been sleeping in that room. A chill ran through me. I slowly walked over, trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe maintenance workers had left them. Maybe another research team had been there recently, but nothing about the room suggested official activity. Everything looked lived in, carefully, quietly, as if whoever stayed there wanted to leave as little evidence as possible. Then I reached out and placed my hand against the wall beside the blankets. I expected cold concrete. Instead, it felt warm. Not slightly warmer. Noticeably warm. The difference was so obvious that I instinctively pulled my hand back before touching it again. The surrounding walls were cold and damp. This section wasn't heat doesn't just stay trapped inside abandoned concrete buildings for no reason. Something or someone had generated that warmth, and judging by how strong it still felt, they couldn't have been gone for very long. I turned toward the doorway. "Take she," I called. "You need to see this." He didn't move. He didn't even look inside. Instead, his expression changed for the first time all day. Not curiosity, not confusion. Fear. Without taking a single step into the room, he quietly shook his head. "Number," I frowned. "What do you mean, no?" He finally looked directly at me. His voice was barely above a whisper. "We leave." No explanation. No discussion. Just those two words. Then he turned around and started walking back toward the hallway without waiting to see whether I followed. I stood there for another few seconds, staring at the blankets, the water bottles, and that impossibly warm wall. One thought kept repeating in my head. Then someone was living on an island that was supposed to be completely abandoned. Asterisk, and whoever they were probably much closer than I realized. I hurried after him. The further we moved away from that apartment, the more unsettled I became. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to step out of one of the dark doorways behind us. Every empty window suddenly felt like a pair of eyes watching from the shadows. "Takeshi," I called, trying to catch up with him. "Has anyone else been here recently?" No response. He continued walking without even turning his head. "What about maintenance crews, security researchers?" Still nothing. It was as if he had decided the conversation was over. That silence bothered me almost as much as what I'd found inside the apartment. If there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, why wouldn't he just tell me? We entered another residential building connected by a narrow concrete walkway. It looked even worse than the first one. Parts of the ceiling had collapsed, twisted pieces of rusted steel hung from cracked concrete, and every gust of wind pushed loose debris across the floor with a dry scraping sound. The deeper we went, the darker it became. Only thin strips of daylight filtered through broken windows, leaving most of the corridors buried in long shadows. I looked ahead. Takeshi had been only a few steps in front of me. Then, he was gone. I stopped walking. "Takeshi." My voice echoed through the empty building before fading into silence. Nothing answered. I checked the rooms on both sides of the hallway, empty. "Takeshi." This time I shouted. Again, nothing. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. People don't simply disappear in an empty hallway. Trying not to panic, I decided to head back the way we'd come, but when I reached the stairwell, I froze. The stairs were gone. Not literally gone. Blocked. A massive pile of broken concrete, bricks, twisted metal, and shattered beams completely filled the entrance. I stared at it in disbelief. I had walked up those exact stairs only minutes earlier. There hadn't been any rubble, no warning signs, no sounds of a collapse, nothing. Yet now the passage was completely sealed. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight across the debris. The broken concrete looked fresh. Dust still drifted lazily through the beam of light. It didn't look like something that had been sitting there for weeks. It looked recent. Impossible, but recent. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I was trapped. I turned to find another exit. That is when I heard it. A single footstep somewhere behind me. Crunch. I spun around. The hallway was empty, then another crunch, followed by another, and another, this time from a different direction. My breathing became shallow. Someone was moving through the building. Number. More than one person. The footsteps didn't sound random anymore. They sounded coordinated, slow, measured. Closing in from different hallways. Every echo bounced off the concrete walls until I couldn't tell exactly where they were coming from. It felt like whoever was out there knew the building far better than I did, and they knew exactly where I was. I didn't stop to investigate. Every survival instinct I had took over. I turned and ran. My boots pounded against the cracked concrete floor as I sprinted through hallway after hallway, taking random turns without thinking. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, not running wildly, following, keeping pace. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but darkness swallowing the corridor behind me. But I could still hear them. Multiple sets of footsteps, steady, deliberate, hunting me through the abandoned apartment complex. For the first time that day, I stopped thinking like an engineer. I wasn't studying the buildings anymore. I was just trying to survive. I didn't care where I was going anymore. Every hallway looked the same. Cracked concrete, broken windows, doorways leading into pitch-black apartments that hadn't officially been occupied in decades. I just kept running. The footsteps behind me never stopped. Sometimes they sounded farther away. Then suddenly they would echo from another corridor, making it feel like whoever was following me had somehow gotten ahead of me. I couldn't tell if they were chasing me or hurting me. That realization nearly made me panic. I forced myself to slow down just enough to think. If I kept running blindly, I'd only get myself trapped again. I needed to find daylight, any opening, any exit. I rounded another corner and spotted a narrow hallway where sunlight spilled through a collapsed section of the wall at the far end. For the first time in several minutes, I had a direction. I sprinted toward it. As I reached the opening, I looked back one last time. The corridor behind me was empty. No figures, no movement. Nothing, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. They echoed somewhere inside the building, bouncing off the concrete walls as if several people were walking just out of sight. I didn't wait to figure out how that was possible. I climbed over the broken concrete, squeezed through the opening, and suddenly found myself outside. Fresh air hit my face. The ocean stretched out in front of me. I could finally see the dock. Without slowing down, I ran across the cracked pavement toward the shoreline. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like they were about to give out. All I wanted was to get back onto the boat. When I reached the dock, I stopped. Tekshi was already there, standing beside the boat, completely calm, hands in his pockets, looking out at the water as if he'd been waiting for me the entire time. He didn't look nervous. He wasn't breathing heavily. There wasn't a scratch on him. It was like nothing unusual had happened at all. I bent over, trying to catch my breath. "What?" I gasped. "Where were you?" He looked at me with the same blank expression I'd seen all morning. "I was checking the schedule." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. "The schedule," I repeated. "I've been looking for you." The stairs were blocked. Someone was following me. He simply looked back toward the island. No surprise, no concern, no questions. Just silence. I waited for some kind of explanation. Any explanation. Instead, he quietly untied the boat, gestured for me to get in, and started the engine. The ride back to the mainland felt much longer than the trip over. Neither of us spoke. I kept replaying everything in my head. The worn path through the dust. The blankets. The empty water bottles. The warm wall. The blocked stairwell. The footsteps. None of it made sense. When we finally reached Nagasaki, I immediately contacted the professor who had arranged my research permit. I wanted answers. I wanted to know if anyone else had experienced something similar. But I never got the chance. Over the next few weeks, every attempt to reach him failed. Emails bounced back unanswered. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Colleagues told me they hadn't seen him in quite some time. It was as if he had simply disappeared. Years have passed since that trip. I've inspected countless abandoned buildings all over the world. Every one of them has logical explanations for the strange things people notice. Except Hashima Island, because no structural problem can explain fresh paths through decades of dust. No engineering principle explains a wall that is still warm inside an abandoned apartment. And no amount of professional experience explains why my guide acted as though he already knew someone was living there. To this day, I still believe I interrupted people who were never supposed to be found. And somehow, they let me leave. The final story takes us to an abandoned island in New York City, where 3 college students hear a friend's voice calling from inside a ruined hospital, only to discover it wasn't their friend at all. By the time this happened, I was in my final semester of college. Like most seniors, I was buried under deadlines, research papers, and the constant pressure of finishing my thesis before graduation. My topic focused on abandoned institutions, their history, architecture, and what happened after people simply walked away from them. One location kept appearing in nearly every source I found: North Brother Island, hidden in New York City's East River between the Bronx and Rikers Island. The island has a dark history. It once housed hospitals, quarantine buildings, and medical facilities that treated some of the city's most dangerous diseases. After decades of abandonment, nature reclaimed almost everything. Trees grew through broken windows. Vines climbed over brick walls. Entire buildings slowly disappeared beneath thick vegetation. Officially, the island is off limits. The city strictly protects it, and unauthorized visitors aren't allowed anywhere near the abandoned structures. To most people, that would have been enough reason to stay away. To 3 curious college students trying to finish a thesis, it sounded like the perfect place to explore. My friends Jansen, Jesse, and I spent weeks planning the trip. We knew going during the day dramatically increased our chances of being spotted, so we made a decision that, looking back, was unbelievably stupid. We'd go at night. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we quietly launched our kayaks into the East River and paddled toward the dark outline of North Brother Island. The city skyline glittered behind us, but with every stroke of the paddle, those lights felt farther away. The island itself was nothing but darkness. No streetlights, no houses, no signs of civilization, just an overgrown mass of trees hiding the ruins beneath them. As our kayaks scraped against the shoreline, an uneasy silence settled over all three of us. Nobody cracked jokes anymore. Nobody laughed. We quietly pulled the kayaks onto shore and began making our way through thick vegetation toward the abandoned hospital buildings. The deeper we walked, the stranger the island felt. Roots had broken through sidewalks decades ago. Small trees grew from rooftops. Broken hospital windows stared back like empty eye sockets. It honestly looked less like New York City and more like the set of a post-apocalyptic movie where humans had disappeared years earlier. Every step echoed through empty hallways. Every gust of wind pushed loose branches against broken glass. Even though we were only a few miles from one of the busiest cities in America, the island felt completely cut off from the rest of the world. We spent nearly an hour exploring, taking photographs and writing notes for my thesis. Eventually, we entered one of the old hospital buildings. The inside was even more unsettling than the outside. Long corridors stretched into darkness. Paint peeled from every wall. Wheelchairs, broken furniture, and rusted hospital equipment sat exactly where they'd been abandoned decades before. Our flashlight beams barely reached the far ends of the hallways. At one point, we split up for only a few minutes so each of us could photograph different sections of the building. It didn't seem like a big deal. After all, we were never more than a hallway or two apart, or at least, that is what I thought. I was standing alone in one of the corridors, writing notes in my notebook, when I suddenly heard someone call my name. It was Jesse, or at least, it sounded exactly like Jesse. His voice came from a room farther down the hallway, clear enough that I didn't hesitate. "Hey," he called my name again. The tone was casual, almost amused. Like he'd found something interesting and wanted me to come take a look. I remember smiling to myself. I honestly thought he was trying to mess with me. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the room. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. No footsteps, no laughter. Just my own breathing echoing through the empty hospital corridor. When I reached the doorway, I raised my flashlight and aimed it inside. The beam slowly crossed the floor, past broken hospital furniture, then stopped in the far corner of the room. Someone was standing there, completely motionless, facing the wall. At first, I actually felt relieved. I thought it was Jesse trying to scare me. The figure was standing perfectly still in the corner, facing the wall with its back toward me. I laughed nervously. "All right, man," I said. "You got me." No response. The person didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even seem to breathe. Something about the silence immediately felt wrong. I took another cautious step into the room, raising my flashlight a little higher. That is when I realized something that made my stomach drop. The figure was far too tall. Much too tall. Jesse was around 6 feet. Jansen was about the same. But this person had to be at least 6.5 feet tall. Maybe even taller. The top of its head nearly reached a section of the wall where the ceiling had partially collapsed. It wasn't just height, either. Its shoulders looked unnaturally broad beneath whatever dark clothing it was wearing, and its arms hung perfectly still at its sides. The strangest part, it never reacted to the light. Most people instinctively turn around when a bright flashlight hits them. This thing didn't. It simply continued facing the wall, completely motionless. Every instinct in my body screamed that I shouldn't get any closer. I didn't call out again. I didn't try to figure out who or what it was. I turned around and ran. Not walked, not backed away. Ran as fast as I possibly could. My footsteps exploded through the empty corridors as I sprinted back the way I'd come. Behind me, I never heard footsteps. I never heard breathing. I never heard the figure chase me. And somehow, that terrified me even more. When I finally found Jansen and Jesse, they were standing together inside another wing of the hospital, looking completely confused. Jesse frowned. "Dude, what is wrong with you?" I could barely catch my breath. "You just called me," I said. He stared at me. "No, I didn't. Stop messing around." "I am serious." Jansen immediately shook his head. "We've been together the whole time." I looked back toward the hallway I'd just come from. There was no way. I knew what I'd heard. It wasn't similar to Jesse's voice. It was identical. The same tone, the same accent. Even the way he said my name. I wanted to leave immediately. Neither of them argued. Something about the look on my face was enough to convince them that whatever had happened wasn't a joke. We made our way back through the overgrown trails as quickly as possible. Nobody spoke. The excitement we'd felt coming onto the island had completely disappeared. All we wanted was to get back onto the water. We reached the shoreline, shoved the kayaks into the river, and climbed inside. Just as we started paddling away, we all heard it. A long, low, painful moan. It echoed across the shoreline behind us. It sounded like an elderly woman crying out in agony somewhere deep within the darkness of the island. Not loud, not theatrical, just heartbreaking. Every paddle stroke became faster. None of us looked back. The sound came only once. But it was enough. We paddled non-stop until we reached the Bronx, where the lights of the city finally made us feel like we were back in the real world. For days afterward, the three of us compared what we'd experienced. Jansen and Jesse admitted they had heard strange noises while exploring, but neither of them had ever called my name. They were together the entire time. There was no opportunity for either of them to prank me. Later, while researching North Brother Island again, I learned that despite its abandoned appearance, the island is closely monitored because it is a protected wildlife sanctuary. Unauthorized visitors aren't supposed to be there, which means something else has always bothered me. When I shined my flashlight into that room, I never actually confirmed the figure was human. And if it wasn't, then what perfectly copied my friend's voice to lure me down that hallway? Even after 10 years, I still don't have an answer. What I do know is this. The three of us weren't alone on North Brother Island that night, and whatever shared that island with us, it wanted us to come closer. Thankfully, we chose to leave instead, but not everyone in tonight's stories was lucky enough to walk away with answers. 3 different islands, 3 completely different people, 3 experiences that still don't have a logical explanation. Maybe every story has a rational answer. Maybe someone really did arrive by boat, looking for Leo. Maybe someone was secretly living inside the abandoned buildings on Hashima Island. And maybe there really was an ordinary person standing inside that hospital on North Brother Island. But some questions refused to go away. How did a complete stranger know Leo's name? Who, or what was following that engineer through an abandoned island that should have been empty? And if Jesse's voice never called from that hospital room, who did? Sometimes the scariest part isn't what you see. It is realizing you'll probably never know the truth. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these 3 stories disturbed you the most? Story 1, the mysterious man who somehow knew Leo's name. Story 2, the hidden occupant of Hashima Island. Or, Story 3, the voice that perfectly copied a friend inside an abandoned hospital. Let me know your answer down in the comments. And if you've ever experienced something you still can't explain, whether it happened while exploring an abandoned place, camping, traveling, working a night shift, or even inside your own home, I want to hear your story. Send it to the email in the description. If it is detailed, true, and genuinely terrifying, your story could be featured in a future video. If you enjoy true horror stories based on real experiences, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. New terrifying stories are uploaded regularly, and trust me, they only get darker from here. Tonight, before you lock your doors, before you turn off the lights, remember this. The most terrifying places aren't always the ones everyone avoids. Sometimes, they're the places that seem completely empty, because an abandoned island isn't nearly as frightening as discovering you were never alone on it to begin with. Good night. Sleep carefully.